Good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. I am working through a little bit of congestion and a cold. I hope my voice stays strong, but I like a loud mic, so I think we should be fine. I was away at Hillview this morning. I preached there, so I ask that you continue to keep Josh McKibben in your prayers. He was there this morning. He's looking a little bit stronger. I know he's still some week from his treatments. I know he does a lot of good there at Hillview, so just continue to pray for him. It's also good that we have so many here with us tonight. I know we have many visitors. We're glad that you're here with us. Mike's brother is here with us. We're glad to see you. I told him that many prayers were offered up on his behalf, and so we're thankful that he is here. I'd like to continue our study tonight in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. The last time we looked at 1 Corinthians, we looked at the first half of this chapter, which deals with marriage. Overall, as we've been looking at the book of 1 Corinthians, we see that there are two major parts to the book. This is a book that's practical for us because it addresses so many different issues and topics. In the first section, we see that Paul addresses Chloe's report and what he had heard from her, particularly the fact that there were divisions among the church there, that they were splintered based upon different factions, based on philosophies or different thoughts of the world. He addresses other topics like the fact that a man had his father's wife, and that was immorality that was not even named among the Gentiles, but it was found in the church. The problem is that they were not acting as a community as they should, and they did not address that sin, but allowed it to continue. And Paul rebukes them for that. We also see that they were not acting as a community when it came to lawsuits and litigation. They were taking their brothers to court, and that was a problem. Paul says it would be better to be defrauded rather than to defraud your brother and take them to court. He also addresses the subject of immorality again. This was not immorality that not even the Gentiles named, but something like prostitution, which was generally accepted in the Corinthian world. Paul says that's not appropriate for Christians. Chapter 7 begins this new section where Paul is addressing some of the things that the Corinthians themselves have written. And so one of the things we see is that they wrote about the question whether it was good for a man not to touch a woman. And so Paul addresses that subject in chapter 7. Paul has a middle ground here. I mentioned some of the philosophies in Corinth would have dealt with either asceticism, which says that we have to keep ourselves from all worldly pleasures. And so some people that practice these ascetic practices would have said that you can't get married. You can't have sexual relationships, even in marriage. You need to abstain from that and be ascetic, avoid all pleasure. Some people went the other extreme and said you need to engage in all the pleasure that you possibly can in hedonism. Paul says neither one of those are biblical or true. And so Paul takes a middle ground. He begins to talk about marriage, and he has some advice that he stays pretty consistent with in this chapter. And that advice is remain as you are. But he also says there are some exceptions to this rule. Paul, as he begins to talk about marriage, is not laying out a rule which everyone has to follow, like everyone must be married to be a Christian, or no one can get married in order to be a Christian. Paul addresses these different circumstances and situations so that they can, in their circumstance, be pleasing to God. We looked at 4 situations last week, and this takes us through verse 16. Those 4 situations, he deals with the concept of sex and marriage in the first 7 verses. And Paul says, give conjugal rights to your partner, your spouse, except there can be a limited time where you, by agreement, are apart or separate. And that's for the purpose of prayer so that then you can come back together. Paul says that the rule is that there is to be sex in marriage. That is a good and beneficial thing. It draws the couple together as they are one flesh. But there can be an exception for a limited time. Paul next addresses in verses 8 and 9 the widows and the widowers. He says, remain unmarried. Unless, and there's an exception here, unless you cannot practice self-control. And if that's the case, then it's okay and all right. It's good to get married. But he says, my advice would be remain as you are. In verses 10 and 11, Paul talks up to the married Christians. The rule is do not divorce. You're not to divorce, you're not to separate, but if one does, the exception here, Paul says, then remain unmarried or else reconcile. And so this is not an excuse or a reason simply to go shopping for a bunch of other spouses. Do not divorce, he says. Then he addresses mixed marriages, and mixed I mean in terms of one is a Christian and one is not a Christian. Paul says, do not divorce. Simply because your spouse is not a Christian, that's not a reason for you to divorce your spouse. But if your spouse, who's not a Christian, divorces or separates from you, then that's the exception here, he says, and you have to let that be so. Other people and their decisions, it's not always under our control what will happen there. So those are the four situations that Paul addresses, and that takes us through verse 16. Really, this chapter consists of three different sections. The next section is found in verses 17 through 24. 17 through 24. And I will read that at this time. 1 Corinthians 7, starting in verse 17. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. Notice Paul's advice continues in this section, and this is actually an aside where he's kind of talking about his general rule, remain as you are. To become a Christian does involve changes. We have to change from a lifestyle of selfishness and sin to one of service to God, but it doesn't mean that we have to automatically change every condition or circumstance we find ourselves in. So he says in verse 20, each one should remain in the condition he was called. And he gives a couple examples of that. First of all, he talks about circumcision and uncircumcision. There were those that taught that in order to become a Christian, based upon prior Jewish practices, you had to be circumcised. Paul addresses that there was a council that addressed that in Acts chapter 15. It is not necessary to be circumcised in order to be a Christian. You don't have to follow the hallmarks of Judaism in order to become a Christian. You can be a Christian whether circumcised or uncircumcised. That doesn't give you any standing before God. What does he say does give you standing before God? Obeying his commandments, doing what he said. He also talks about this idea of being a bondservant or a slave versus a freedman. There's no law or rule which says that you cannot be a slave and a Christian. There's nothing that says you have to be a freedman. And if you're a slave, then you're out of luck. That's not what the Bible teaches. That's not the message of the gospel. Paul says that you can be a servant, a slave, and be a Christian. And if you're in that circumstance, you can still serve and honor God. Not only that, but you can be a freedman. You don't need to seek slavery in whatever circumstance you find yourself. Give yourself to the Lord. It's interesting in this passage as well that they would have been well aware of benefactors or those that would have bought the freedom of a slave and made them free. But notice what he says. He says that you are bondservants, or you are freedmen of the Lord. Freedmen of the Lord. In a very real sense, Christ had purchased their freedom. That might not have changed their physical circumstances, but in a very real way, Christ had purchased their freedom. So whether they were slaves or free in this world, they were freedmen in Christ. They had something more important. But here we see Paul's contention as he takes this aside, remain as you are. And that would apply to both the case of circumcision and slavery. The next section is found in verses 25 through the end of the chapter. 25 through the end of the chapter. We've been addressing various situations, and Paul talks to those four groups that we saw in the first 16 verses. Now he talks to those that are betrothed to be married. Betrothed to marry. Let's read in verses 25 through 27, or 28. 25 through 28. Now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. The ESV is unique in translating this word as betrothed. You might notice that many other translations use the word virgins. It's a little bit difficult to know exactly the group that he's talking about. This is a group that have not been married, and it may be not just that, but the fact that they have been betrothed. And so now what should they do in that circumstance? And so Paul is going to address that situation. He says, remain as you are. You see his advice in verse 27. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Paul's advice, and he has some caveats here. This is his advice. He thinks it's wise. Remain as you are. He goes on to say, if you do not remain as you are, though, you have not sinned. This is a matter of wisdom. This is a matter of judgment that each person needs to take into account based upon their circumstances and their situation. If you marry, it's not a sin. But notice he says that there are some extra concerns. So why does Paul say that people should remain as they are, particularly to those that are betrothed? He's actually going to give a couple of reasons for his advice, and we notice these as we read through that passage in 25 through 28. The first one is the present distress. Because of the present distress, you need to remain as you are. And the second one is based upon worldly troubles. Worldly troubles. He's going to use a couple of paragraphs here to explain each one of those situations. The present distress is going to be explained in verses 29 through 31, and the worldly troubles in 32 through 35. So let's notice some of those things. First of all, in 29 through 31. 29 through 31, let's read that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. You know, some passages are just so clear they need no comment, right? We can just move on from here. What is Paul talking about with this idea of this present distress? And he goes on to talk about this. Some people believe that this present distress refers to an incident within the world or a situation, something like a famine, or maybe it was something along the lines of some kind of persecution. Something was happening that created a peculiar circumstance that would have called for Paul's advice not to marry here. One of the problems that some scholars have noticed, and this doesn't prove the case, but there's no indication, though, at Corinth during the time that this was written, that there was any kind of thing like that. Now, it's still possible that there was some, situation out there that Paul's referencing, but there's no indication from extra-biblical sources about what that might be. Based on this context as well, we may see that Paul is not addressing something like a famine or persecution, but maybe he's talking about the fact that the Lord will come again. Notice at the beginning here, he talks about this shortened time. The time is short, he says. There was a view Paul was looking for here, the coming of Christ. And so this present distress may be, in light of the fact that Christ is coming, this is Paul's advice. We see that he concludes that section in verse 31, say, "For the present form of this world is passing away." This may indicate that this is not so much something like a famine or something like that, but these are the general circumstances of life now that Christ has come. Now that the new age is here, the last days, this is something that is different. And so as he says, he goes through these language, if you have a wife, live as if you don't. If you have worldly goods. I don't know how to explain exactly what he means by that, but things have changed. Now that the kingdom of Christ has come, it has ushered in a new way of viewing things. A new priority exists in life as we recognize that Jesus will come again. That demands for the Christian all of our attention, our thoughts, our minds should be on that. And so Paul says, based upon that, I would ask that you would remain as you are. If you're not married, then that's a good situation to be in because you can devote yourself in that regard. And so he says, Christ is coming again. And based upon that, then that is my advice. He also talks about worldly troubles, and we'll read in verses 32 through 35. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about the worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. And you see how these two things tie in together. If this present distress is a looking for the coming of Jesus Christ, he says here now as we talk about these worldly troubles, there can be distractions, commitments that we make that might keep us from other things. For the unmarried, he says here that the concern for the unmarried is to be anxious, to be concerned with the things of the Lord. They don't have to be distracted with other obligations. Their interests are undivided. They can, with singular focus upon the Lord and his work. Now, for the married, it's different. The married person is anxious or concerned with the affairs of their spouse, how to please their spouse, how to do things for their spouse. And so they have divided interests, Paul says. They can't singularly devote themselves to the Lord in terms of their time and energy because they have made other obligations. Now, when Paul talks about this, he makes the point clear that this is not a matter of sin or not. If you're in either one of these circumstances, it's not a sinful thing to be unmarried. It's not a sinful thing to be married. You'll notice that there are benefits on each side of the equation and obligations on each side of the equation. And so in a congregation, we're going to find those that are both, some that are married, some that are unmarried, different benefits can be found within each individual and their gifts and talents. And Paul, I think, makes that point. And so we see some of the reason behind his advice to remain as you are and why it can be good to be single. Paul certainly demonstrated that in his own life as he devoted himself full time to the preaching and proclamation of the gospel. He talks elsewhere about the fact that he did not have a wife and how that might take away from his ability to devote himself in that regard. There's one other situation we notice in verses 39 through 40, and I don't know if this simply provides some summarizing principles, but it does address those that are married and then those that are widows. Notice in 39 and 40. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. Paul says here that if you are married, you are bound for life. That's the intent of marriage. Marriage is not intended to be a temporary thing, but rather a permanent thing. If you're married, you are bound for life. The exception to that would be obviously if your spouse dies. Then you are no longer bound, Paul says. And so you are free to marry, but not obligated to marry. Paul adds the language here, only in the Lord, according to the ways of the Lord. Some people will also point to the fact that you would need to marry a Christian if you're remarrying. And so we see that language here in verses 39 and 40. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Let me notice a few lessons as we close here tonight. First of all, marriage is a commitment. Marriage is a commitment. We've seen that a few times in this text. First of all, it says in verse 39, a wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. When you give yourself in marriage, you're making a lifelong commitment. It's a commitment for the duration of your life. It's not short term. It's not a commitment until something bad happens, until I have a difficulty, until we have an argument. It is a commitment for life. We furthermore see this commitment when Paul talks about the anxieties of worldly things. That is that you will be concerned with, you should be concerned with, anxious over how to please your spouse. You've given yourself to them. You've devoted yourself to them. And so their interests, their well-being should be of concern to you. You've devoted yourself in that regard. That's not a bad thing. It's not sinful. We're not talking about anything like that. But you need to understand the obligation when you go into marriage. Even when you're married, you need to remember the obligation. This is an obligation for life. You're to be concerned with your spouse. Anxious, a lot of times that has a bad connotation, something that you're concerned with. You never act in a way towards your spouse that you could care less what they think or feel. No, you're always concerned with how they're feeling, what they're thinking. You're seeking to understand, and yes, to even please your spouse. Marriage is a commitment. But having said that, we need to also say that singleness is to be commended. Singleness is to be commended. We live in a society where often the expectation is that you would get married. And that's what many people want. That's what many people desire. But Paul says that being single is not a bad thing. It's to be commended. In fact, whether you're married or single, you'll notice that there are obligations and benefits. If you devote your time in this area, that's automatically going to take your time away from another area. If you're married, you're going to have to devote time and effort and energy to your marriage. That's what's required. If you're not married, you don't have those obligations. You don't have that commitment. It frees you up to work for the Lord in a way different from those that are married. And that's to be commended. We shouldn't pressure people, oh, you should get married. When are you going to get married? I'll also add that singleness is a situation you need to be careful with. Some singleness is by intention or decision. Some is not. And there's a lot of feelings that are wrapped up in all of that. We need to be aware of each individual, encourage them to the best of our ability. I was thinking about in terms of preaching. If a young man decides that he wants to preach, I know that there are many Christians that would wrap their arms around him. They would encourage him. You've devoted yourself to the Lord and preaching the gospel. That is such a great thing. What would happen if a young person said, I want to be single? Would people talk to them and take them aside and say, well, that's okay, but you're going to have trouble? Would we begin to discourage a person from saying, I want to be single for the Lord? Or would we do the same thing with the young man that's preaching? That is a great commitment. That's a great dedication. You can serve the Lord, and the Lord will be glorified in your actions. Paul says, who is a single man, singleness is to be commended. He doesn't say that by way of law or of necessity. You have to be single. But it's a valid option. It's a good option. It's a commendable option as long as you are living unto the Lord. Singleness is to be commended. We should also see from this text that we should be living like the Lord is coming back. When we see that Paul, if we believe that Paul is referencing the return of Jesus Christ, 2,000 years later, some people in their arrogance might look at that and say, poor Paul, he just didn't know any better. He thought the Lord was coming then, but he was wrong. And we can see that because we're 2,000 years down history. Actually, Paul never pinpoints the date or time of when Christ is coming. But he gives us a mindset and a model that, yes, we need to have even 2,000 years later. We need to live like the Lord is returning. Notice the urgency that he has in serving the Lord. He says that it should consume our minds, our thoughts. He says it would be even better if we were to not marry so that we can completely devote ourselves to the cause, to what is good, to what is right. Paul had the mindset that he was going to live like the Lord is returning. 2,000 years later, it's easy to say, Paul didn't know what he was talking about. Lord's not coming. Lord's not coming soon. And we can begin to forget the fact that the Lord is coming back. We may know it in the back of our minds, but do we live like that's going to happen? Is it at the forefront of our minds? Does it affect the way we act, the way we talk, the way we live? Or is it simply on the back burner? Paul's not identifying, again, the day or time. He's not predicting, saying, I know on this date and time the Lord is coming. But what Paul is telling us is that the Lord's return should not be on the back of our minds, but on the front of our minds. It should affect our actions, the way we live. So my question for you tonight is, are you living like the Lord will most definitely, certainly return? That needs to be your mindset. There's a lot more we could learn from this chapter. I hope it's been beneficial for you. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, you have an opportunity to obey the gospel message, believing that Jesus is the Christ, repenting of your sins, confessing Jesus as the Christ, and being baptized in the water for forgiveness of sins. If you're a Christian and not living as you should, this congregation would be happy to pray with you and for you and help you in any way that we can. If there's any subject to the invitation, please come as we stand and sing at this time.